How's everyone doing tonight?
Good.
Cool. My name is Snehal. I actually teach in the English department, and I teach about Islamophobia. I have a class called Islamophobia in Literature, and I take a slightly different take on this than I think most people do, or perhaps even the Sheikh does, in that I do not believe that Islamophobia is a fear that people have about the other. It is the necessary consequence of political ideology that has been mobilized after the end of the Cold War to justify American geopolitics and strategy in the Middle East. That before the end of the Cold War, Islam was America's best ally in the war against communism. In fact, I don't know if any of you watched the Sylvester Stallone, the Rambo movies, but if you look at Rambo 3 and 4, it's very interesting how much the Mujahideen in Afghanistan are seen as the best friends that America has against the Soviet Union, and how much America loves Islam. The pictures of George W. Bush with, important Saudi officials walking arm in arm, etc. This was never about fear, and it is never about some congenital hatred between Muslims and Christians and Jews, but actually a set of political policies that have been mobilized at a particular time to justify the reorganization of the Middle East in particular, but also to justify American interests abroad. It is also, and I feel the need to say this because a lot of people don't believe that Islamophobia is a racism. It is a racism, and I can say this to you not just from personal experience, but because there's a particular vision or version of Muslim that is captured our imagination in the American media that has very particular phenotypic expression, tends to behave in a certain kind of way, usually is shifty with a beard, reads the Quran endlessly. In fact, one of the major tropes of Islamophobia is that reading the Quran makes one a kind of terrorist programmed robot that just behaves in the world in a particular way. So it is a racism, and I want to say that also because a lot of people, I think of it as a fear of a religion. But I am not a Muslim. My parents are Jains. It's a minority religion in India. I myself am an atheist. But after 9/11, everybody thought that I was a Muslim. I have a beard, I'm brown, I'm male, I spoke at Palestinian rallies, and so I became a Muslim sort of in that way that races are coded by phenotypic expression. And it was a really enlightening or eye-opening moment for me to think about how exactly racial formation has changed over the course of my lifetime. Interestingly enough, maybe this will be of interest to you, in 1975, when I am born, my birth certificate says that I am white, because according to the way that American immigration policy worked in the 1970s, to justify Indian immigration to the United States, we had to be classified as Aryans in the race category. In the 80s, I became Indian. In the 90s, I was South Asian. And then in the 2000s, I became Muslim. This was my kind of racial identity over my lifetime. It's a very interesting thing to think about like how porous and malleable racial categories are, and just how much they can change, despite the fact that we think of them as very real, material, and hard phenomenon. The second thing that I want to say, and I hope the Sheikh won't take too much offense at this, but videos like the one that he showed bother me slightly because they play into another one of the major tropes of Islamophobia in the United States, which is the paradigm of the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. There is a version of the good Muslim that we are given. The good Muslim is one who is democratic, who hates terrorists, who talks about Islam as a religion of peace, who condemns a terrorist at any given moment, but is almost always seen as the mouthpiece of American political interests in the Middle East. He is moderate, meaning that he does not support, or she does not support, certain kinds of political strategies in Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and the rest of it, does not speak about why American imperialism in the region is devastating the lives of millions of people. And that version of the good Muslim is the sanitized version of the Muslim that you see in videos like that. I think that Muslims have every right to be angry and should not feel at all apologetic about being angry or being whatever kinds of politics that they ought to have. But there's a kind of way that a sanitized middle-class version of Islam is packaged for television, for popular consumption, and spread to us to give us a sense that there's a kind of civil war happening inside of Islam between good Muslims and bad Muslims. And if we can just get the good Muslims on our side, then the bad Muslims will be easier to identify. But the problem is that in American political ideology, a bad Muslim is anyone who opposes American foreign policy, and a good Muslim is every Muslim who agrees with American foreign policy. And that's the way that it has always been with every religion and every race and every kind of sort of ideological division that you want to imagine. This is a point made very forcefully by a scholar from Columbia University named Mahmoud Mamdani in a book called Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, which I highly encourage you to read if you haven't read. Makes this point about how we can attempt to how American ideology attempts to construct this notion of Muslims as having, particular sets of dispositions which seem to always turn around whether or not America is doing right or wrong in the world. But the other thing that I think is central to Islamophobia in the American context, and we should be really clear, especially in a talk sponsored by the Palestine Solidarity Committee, is that Islamophobia has, in the American political context, been very, very deeply structured by a rhetoric of anti-Semitism and a rhetoric of Zionist politics, which sees Islam as necessarily antithetical to the existence of and the politics of the State of Israel. In fact, the majority of campaigns about Islamophobia, and we can name them relatively clearly. They tend to be around whether or not new mosques should be built. Famously in Boston, a major campaign against the Boston mosque in 2007, a campaign against the Park 50, what is it called in New York? Park 51, the Cordoba House, also in New York. There have been a number of these sorts of campaigns that have been done, and usually we think of them as campaigns that have been structured by the right wing, the Christian right wing in the United States, but they really have a deep, deep connection to Zionist organizations in the US, which have tried to put forward the argument that good Muslims are Muslims which will support Israel, bad Muslims are the ones that support Palestine. And in fact, part of the reason why you get the hostility that you get for wearing a Free Palestine sticker on your car, or having a Free Palestine bumper sticker on your car, is because this argument has become very, very prevalent among Zionist organizations here in the United States. That support for Palestine is de facto anti-Semitic. And this argument has been, sort of, I guess, bread and butter Zionist politics for the last 40 or 50 years in the United States, and has been used to structure a kind of way that we think about advocacy in the United States, so that the Muslim Student Association, as a national organization, is probably the most closely monitored student organization by federal law enforcement of any politically active, well, now they're mostly inactive because of the politically monitoring, but the Muslim Student Association, because of its ties to the Holy Land Foundation and other sort of charities that did work in Palestine, has become one of the most heavily surveilled student groups in the United States today. But I want to say something else. Huh? Muslim Student Association, MSA, nationally. I think that I don't know if is anybody from the MSA here? Some of you? I think this is a well-known fact. I don't know if anybody disputes this, but this is a fact that is kind of documented in a great book called The Muslims Are Coming by Arun Kudnani. That many of you might be familiar with the case of the MSA at UCLA, which was put under receivership, and then all of their assets were frozen in 2003, I want to say, after they had made a sizable contribution to the Holy Land Foundation, which is a charitable group doing work in Palestine. So this is a kind of reality that we should be frank about. The reason for that, I think, is really quite clear, both in the way that Islamophobia structures American political ideology and why it's so bound up in politics about Israel, is because what the United States does in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what Israel does in Gaza and in the West Bank, would be absolutely unjustifiable in any other context, but for the fact that Islamophobia allows us to believe that Muslims are subhuman, barbaric, terrorists deserving of the kinds of fates that are assigned to them. That is the only reason that those campaigns are allowed to happen. Think about every story that you were told about Afghanistan and Iraq, about why we had to go to war in those places, and what remains of the narrative about why United States military is still involved in those regions. We were told weapons of mass destruction, turned out to be a lie. We were told we are bringing democracy, turned out to be a lie. We were told we were saving women, turned out to be a lie. We were told they are providing safe havens for Al-Qaeda, turned out to be a lie. Everything that we were told about what exactly were the military operations and their justifications for us to go to war in those places turned out to be wrong, except for Islam. That is the only thing repeatedly that they've been able to come to over and over again to justify continued support for these campaigns in these kinds of military campaigns and the kinds of death that has happened. If you think about the border region between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the number of people who have been killed by drone strikes, completely unjustifiable except for the fact that they are Muslims, and somehow being born a Muslim means you're at risk of being a suicide bomber or a terrorist, because it's, of course, the Quran is a kind, I think I make this metaphor all the time. There seems to be some way we think about in the United States that if you read the Quran repeatedly over and over again, you become a terrorist. That's the kind of note. And this is why, if you've seen Homeland, right? I don't know, probably the most Islamophobic show on television today, but Homeland, over and over again, when you want to prove that somebody is a terrorist, you have them praying in front of the Quran and reading it over and over again. And that's like the, oh my God moment, here comes the terrorist. Because there's some belief that terrorism is not about politics, which is what it is about, but it's about something religious, which it has nothing at all to do with. Religion, in fact, has nothing to do with any of the geopolitical questions in Israel, Palestine, Iraq, or Afghanistan. It has everything to do with politics, and that's, I think, the other story. So if you think about what you know about Iraq and Syria today, you know very little about political organizations that might be mobilizing on the ground. You know very little about the debates that have been taking place in civil society about what kind of constitutional futures people imagine for themselves. You know very little about the social protests that have been taking place in the major cities. All you know is ISIS and beheadings. That will be the only thing that you know because it is the easiest narrative to sell about what exactly is taking place and why it is worth American interest to be, sort of focusing in on thinking about this. This is also part of the reason why a narrative emerged over the course of the summer, which I think was a very dangerous narrative, but it emerged and became part of the way that we now talk about Israel-Palestine, and it was the Hamas equals ISIS equation, slightly less stupid than the ISIS equals Ebola equation, which we were also given not too long ago. But Hamas equals ISIS, that all Muslim political formations are the same, that they all somehow dangerously slip into terrorism, that they might not actually have aspirations that have anything to do with anything other than violence, that Hamas might actually represent a kind of challenge to the political corruption that the Palestinian Authority and Fatah had represented inside the West Bank and Gaza. None of that is part of the story of what you hear. You only hear the Hamas equals ISIS, and it's not sort of surprising that behind this had been a kind of a campaign by people like Netanyahu, people like Avigdor Lieberman in Israel to try to make this equation such that it would fit into an American foreign policy narrative that had already become easy to sell in the United States. Because if you looked at what happened both in 2007, 2009, and then in the most recent sort of campaign in the Gaza Strip, the kinds of horrors that Palestinians have been subjected to is unimaginable. And the fact that this has been allowed to go on without a kind of major outcry from the international community in any serious way, it tells you just how deeply the Islamophobic narrative runs. The fact that Gaza is, and this is not me being hyperbolic, this is also not me trying to draw a comparison to Nazi Germany lightly, Gaza is the biggest open-air concentration camp in the world today. And the condition of life in Gaza is not dissimilar to life in the camps in Auschwitz or in Dachau. We cannot separate the facts of like what history has done and what we are now consigning millions of people to, the fates that we're assigning to. But we refuse to see this connection because the narrative around Islam has become so thick and heavy that it is impossible to actually think about what are not just the political implications, not just the ethical implications, but the real human implications of what happens inside of Israel and Palestine. I think that maybe, and I hope that I'm being provocative enough that we can have a good conversation. I think that's usually my role at these things, is to be super provocative, and then you all say, like, but what about this, or that didn't make any sense, or what have you. I think that we have a real problem and a challenge here about Islamophobia, because this has been the rocks on which both the pro-Palestine movement in the United States and the anti-war movement in the United States have crashed and burned on, has been their unwillingness to tackle and challenge Islamophobia frontally. And I say this as somebody who's not a Muslim, to many of you in the room who are Muslims, that it has been the unfortunate reality that Islamophobia in the United States in the last decade has forced Muslims into a very conservative political posture in this country in which they've refused to challenge and tackle Islamophobia publicly and frontally. And this is just a sort of a fact that I think we need to confront and address and think very seriously about what that has meant. That it is not the case that the anti-war movement from 2001 until the present was led by Muslims or Arab Americans. It was largely led by the secular left in the United States, largely white, in fact, were the people who were at the front of that movement. It is also not the case that the majority of the movement for Palestine on college campuses is led by Arabs and Muslims. It's actually the secular left on most college campuses that has been doing it. And we need to talk really seriously about how, until there is a kind of confident movement of Muslims in this country demanding a change in the ways that the United States talks about foreign policy, and a change in the way that we talk about race and race relations in this country, that these sorts of things will continue. Because this is the claim that I made a couple of months ago about the Ferguson to Palestine kinds of connections that some people in Gaza were drawing when they saw the connections between what was happening to black Americans by American police officers and what was happening to Palestinians. They saw the connections intimately. But it was not the case that most Muslims saw the connections intimately. It was also not the case that most African Americans saw the connections intimately. We, I think, have to be part of a new wave of thinking about not just geopolitics, not just Israel-Palestine, but race relations in this country, because it has been the single greatest barrier to the development of politics which will actually transform and change the way that American foreign policy is conducted and Israeli foreign policy is conducted. Because I think that for the first time in a very, very long time, public opinion is beginning to shift on the question of Palestine. More and more college campuses are taking upon themselves to get involved in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. UCLA is just the most recent example. Princeton has been recently mired in lots and lots of debate and struggle and activism around the question of Palestine. But we can go through the list: University of Chicago, Harvard, Columbia, UC Berkeley, et cetera. A number of schools sort of taking this question on. I think that we need to ask ourselves about what it will take to build an important enough and strong enough coalition of people on US campuses to begin to change the narrative, not just about Israel and Palestine, but about Islam. I say this too because how many of you were on campus 2 years ago when the bomb threat happened? Do you remember the sort of tower's response to the bomb threat, that somebody with a Middle Eastern sounding accent made the bomb threat, this sort of thing? This is not a sort of casual bit of mistake made by an inept person in the UT administration or bureaucracy. This is how we now think about violence. The first culprit is always Islam when it is a spectacular kind of violence that happens in the United States. And until that perception is seriously challenged by confident Muslims, I think we can expect much more of this to happen. I'll end with the most recent events. How many of you followed the synagogue attack that happened yesterday in Israel? Yes? Okay. So very, very interesting to think about the way that has been framed in the media. Number one, the first thing to say is that while one regrets the loss of every life, and I think that what happened in the synagogue was absolutely tragic, not a single tear was shed in the United States when Muslims were killed in mosques during the most recent operation in Gaza, and not a single tear was shed when it happened during Ramadan. Right? Not a single tear was shed when that was happening during their sort of religious festivals. Not a single tear was also shed when Palestinian Americans were killed. But now the sort of framing of the deaths in Israel are about three Israeli Americans being killed in a synagogue. And you can see the ways that there are kind of not just rhetorical structures, but also political lenses through which this certain kind of violence is viewed, which affords both Israel and the United States to make themselves appear as though they are the victims of this thing called Islam. Islam is not one thing. It is not an ideology. It is not a monolith. It is not the Quran. Islam is the way that people interpret and live their religion. But not every Muslim is reducible to their religion, and that is the mistake that has been made by every Islamophobe to date, is to try to connect the body of a person to the sort of like genetic DNA that they seem to think is encoded on them from birth by virtue of their being a Muslim, when all of this has to do, and this is the point I began with and it'll be the point that I end with, everything about Islamophobia and everything about racism in the United States has to do with politics. There's a reason for it. It emerges at a particular time. It is an ideology. It also goes away. The West has had a variety of relationships to Islam. This is just the most recent incarnation, but it will not change until a sufficient efficient kind of politics is also organized on our side to demand a different set of priorities for American foreign policy in the Middle East, a different set of standards for the state of Israel in which how it conducts its own kind of foreign policy with respect to Palestine. But ultimately, until we actually get a real conversation about race in this country, in which Muslims are also not just kind of a part of the conversation, but demanding very, very strongly that racism in this country structures the very fabric of how we live and has to be done away with fundamentally. Because otherwise, and I hope the Sheikh will forgive me, we're forced to this kind of, we're forced to parading ourselves in this kind of caricatured way. Look, we're really good people too. You know, and I don't know why we should have to prove ourselves in this way. Nobody else has to prove themselves in this way. It's humiliating to have to go and produce a video in which you say, look, I'm human too. I can bleed, I can sing, I can dance, I can watch Grey's Anatomy, the whole lot of it. I mean, this should be a given. And it should be completely okay for us to be angry, loud, passionate, and political about the actual oppressions that are happening in the world, and not have to be forced to like parade around our kind of parade our humanity as if it was something that needed to be proved. And that's, I think, the fundamental mistake that we have made for the last 15 years in this country, is we've allowed the Islamophobes to reduce us to this kind of humiliating caricature of what good Muslim means, as opposed to the reality, which is that Islam is a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's no reason why anybody should have to defend what another person does if they come from the same religion. The Christians don't feel the need to do it, the Jews don't feel the need to do it, atheists don't feel the need to do it, the Hindus certainly don't do it. They have massacres happening against Muslims in India as we speak. Why the hell should Muslims have to do it? And that is, I think, that is the thing that I take from the last 15 years of American political and social life in this country, is that we have been forced to actually play a kind of humiliating role in social life in this country, by which we have to not only apologize for crimes committed by others, we have to feel apologetic for being who we are. And that is exactly the sort of I cannot be Pakistani, I must act a Latino in school to avoid Islamophobia problem. So not only do I think we need to take on the questions of foreign policy and how we think about geopolitics, we also have to take on the fact that this is about a conversation about American racism, and we have to do undo American racism in a very serious way if there's going to be an end to Islamophobia, and if we ever hope to have politics in this country which can liberate Palestine once and for all. Thanks.
The general scope that we are talking about now is a demonization of Islam. This is not something new. It's only been just more funded in a very focused way in the past 10 years here in America and throughout the world, not just by Western governments, by the way, but even by the United Arab Emirates, who have taken a stand, very curious stand, aligning themselves more with Israel against the Palestinians, namely because the Muslim Brotherhood to them is an avowed enemy, and Hamas has connections to the Muslim Brotherhood, but to the point where the United Arab Emirates has even labeled organizations in the United States of America as being terrorists, that America itself does not label as terrorists. So a majority Muslim country is calling CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, a terrorist organization. They're the most peaceful people you can meet. They're very bold. They don't back down. They call out the FBI, they call out the government, but they have never advocated violence. And so this idea of putting the label of terrorism on any organization which is bold enough to speak out, as we say, speak truth, right, to power, right away labeled as terrorism. So the title here, I think, is obvious to all of you who are here because you are concerned people, right? And that is the real terror that takes place. If you just look at statistics, which I think the professor is going to go through, the real terror that takes place is what is done by states, whether it's our own country, United States of America, whether it's by the state of Israel, whether it's by the state of Egypt, whether it's by Saudi Arabia, whether it's, I mean, actually no country almost can be excluded. I don't want to make this seem like we're against certain countries and for certain countries. What we are for is truth and justice. As generic as that sounds, that is the reality. As people of faith, at least where I'm speaking from in my perspective. The Quran teaches us always to be with the truth and with the justice, no matter who it's with and no matter who you may stand against. So even if you are against your own self or your own family or your own country, then you always stand. So because of that general atmosphere of Islamophobia, this has a pervasive effect on the young Muslims growing up in this country. When we talk about fear, this is an emotion that is very powerful. It's an emotion that will lead a person to form all kinds of assumptions, most of them false, about the other. And fear, not only can it become paralyzing, but fear leads to irrational behavior. Right? If you had a caged lion who hasn't eaten, who hasn't drunk any water, who's been abused, right? And this is the way you're treating him day in, day out, you cannot expect that lion to act like a house cat. Right? I think the analogy is not too far stretched when we talk about what's being referred to as the open air prison of Gaza. Because I was listening on one of the NPR stations and they had some people asking, they say, how come the people in Gaza were celebrating the attack on the synagogue? And they were trying to compare people living in that environment, being bombarded, having their own killed, with a person like myself. I can feel more about what's going on in the synagogue than maybe someone who's being bombarded in Gaza, because I just had my nice Starbucks with a croissant. I'm over here comfortable. I'm not worried about someone attacking me. I'm not worried about someone killing me. My mother and father, alhamdulillah, they're alive. My brothers and sisters weren't killed. And so this fear from the other side as well. Because an oppressor, believe it or not, fears and cannot sleep at night because of his oppression. When someone wrongs another person, there is a fear that comes. If a person does an injustice, that person experiences fear that those that he did injustice to, that they will take their revenge. Right? Obviously, we're not advocating revenge in Islam. Islam is not about revenge. Islam is about truth and reconciliation. I really like what Desmond Tutu termed what he did in South Africa between the whites and the blacks. You have to have the truth and reconciliation. You can also find the same thing in the story of the Bible with Joseph and his brothers. In the Quran with Yusuf alayhi salam and the Asbat and his brothers. The truth had to come out. They said, Tallahi laqad atharaka Allahu alayna. They said, indeed, Allah has chosen you over us. And we were wrong to you. And we treated you badly. And then what was the reconciliation? Joseph, what did he say to his brothers? He said, لا تثريب عليكم اليوم يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. He said, no blame on you, my brothers, this day. Even though they did all of that, everybody I think knows the story of Joseph. And there's probably been Hollywood movies about it, right? Okay, he said, no blame on you, my brothers. That's the reconciliation. But you cannot have reconciliation until the truth comes out. And that truth is very painful. And the oppressor and the oppressed both saying what has happened to them and acknowledging the other is a part of this solution. Some people think that the solution is going to end up being some military kind of solution on both sides. And for sure there will be more wars, but still, wars are never the end solution. There always has to be some other diplomatic, political solution, even at the end of wars. And I think a big part of it will be truth and reconciliation. So the other aspect, the hatred of the unknown. And so our position, or at least my position, is that many of the governments today, and without picking on any government, but many of the governments today, they use the general population's own xenophobia, their own paranoia, to put forward foreign policies that will, in fact, obliterate not just whole villages, but sometimes and potentially whole cultures. And I'm not just talking about Muslim cultures, right? In the not too recent past, or actually in the 80s, right? If you look at what happened, and we're still seeing the ramifications, what happened in South America because of certain foreign policy here. So this is a reality that the West, in particular, being so far ahead scientifically, has the capacity to eliminate, not just eliminate people, but has the capacity with the media to make it palpable and to convince people that it's okay to kill 100,000 people because it's better than them killing us. Or they hate us so much, and all those people want to do is want to kill us, and all they do, they hate us and they're jealous of us, and actually they love to die anyway, and maybe they're not even really human beings. This is a reality. People are thinking this way. It goes back not just to the Crusades, even before then, but in the Crusades, they used to have pictures of Muslims with tails. And people used to believe that Muslims actually had tails, like devils. Do we have people going around like this today? I'll just end with this. And you judge for yourself. I was walking dressed like this, but I also had, the kafiyah, you have the red one. I had the red one. I was walking down on North Lamar, right, around the mosque. There was a person in his nice SUV going to his church. It was on a Sunday. I'm not picking on Christians or anything, but this is a reality. This is a churchgoer on Sunday. And he saw me dressed like that walking on Lamar. And he slowed down a little bit, and he made his hand like a gun. He looked right at me, he pointed at me, and then he goes like that, like this. Right. This is how much fear and hatred has been put into the hearts and minds of the people, that if the green light is given, that there could be, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but there could be tremendous loss of life for Muslims or anybody actually who continues to speak out against the system. I don't want to end on a negative note. The same time that takes place, I do interfaith dialogue with Rabbi Alan Friedman, who's from the Reformed congregation. Also interact with Rabbi Neil Blumoff. And they have strong positions about Israel, and also I have strong positions about the Palestinians' rights. But we still talk, we still get together, and we still do dialogue. They bring their students to our mosque. We bring our students to their synagogues.